Joined now here live in the studio by David Coleman and Sam Dastyari. David Coleman, congratulations. You're now the chair of the House Economics Committee.
Thank you, Peter.
And as I understand it, you were also responsible for the Senate Reform Committee as well.
That's right. I chaired that inquiry recently, yes.
And Sam Dastyari, you're now Bill Shorten's Parliamentary Secretary, former head of the Senate's Economics Committee. So before we get to some of the issues in the mix that we're going to talk about in those sort of spaces, Sam Dastyari, let me start by getting your reaction to the Senate reforms during the week, and indeed some of what the Greens leader told us in terms of preference arrangements. You were here on this program some years ago predicting problems with the Greens' relationship with Labor. It looks like that is the direction it's gone.
Yeah, I hate to be proven right, but I sat here 4 years ago with both you and Paul here and said that the path we are going down is going to end badly, that the Greens political party are not our friends, they're not our comrades in arms, they're a rival political party, and that frankly the Labor Party has to completely reassess its political relationship with them. I think if we had have done more of that over the past 4 years, we wouldn't be in the situation we are now. And a lot of what Richard Di Natale just said was completely disingenuous. Completely disingenuous. Let's be clear. The preference arrangement between the Labor Party and the Greens is a signed deal done by their chief negotiator and the National Secretary of the Labor Party. This idea that, oh, there's this local thing and people on the ground do their own thing flies in the face of a signed agreement that has been done at every election since 1990.
But your party has nothing to offer them now. The Senate reform process, we can talk about the merit or otherwise in terms of what it does for democracy, but in a purely strategic sense, from my read of it, the Labor Party now has nothing it can offer the Greens. You used to be able to offer them preferences in the Senate, and they would give you preferences in key marginal lower house contests as part of this agreement. Now, why would they ever come to the Labor Party?
Well, let's be clear. What we used to offer them, and we used to offer each other, was a progressive parliament and a progressive Australia and a progressive parliamentary majority. Now, if you actually look, what are the seats the Greens are actually going to target at this election? They're going to target Grainla, they're going to target Sydney, they're going to target some of the Labor seats down in Melbourne. Obviously, they hold the federal seat of Melbourne, but other seats kind of down in Melbourne. They're
all Labor held?
All Labor held. All Labor held. What they're doing is actually going after progressive voters and progressive Australians. And the thing that appalls me most about the behaviour of the Greens at the moment is that the extent to which they're behaving as conservative lapdogs. So on one hand, they'll do all the rhetoric, all this left-wing rhetoric, and in reality, they're actually helping facilitate this government's agenda.
David Coleman, you looked into the Senate reform process, you know, arm's length from the lower house, I suppose you could say. We spoke here on Australian Agenda to the new Minister, Special Minister of State responsible, Matthias Coleman, last weekend, and he told us that there was no strategic play that was involved in the thinking around Senate reform. It was purely about enhancing the system. Come on, that's not true, is it? Surely the Liberal Party must have been aware of the strategic benefit of the Senate reform that's been chased.
No, well, Peter, I mean, people have been talking about Senate reform for many years, as you know, and this is about ensuring that the will of voters is actually represented, and that's what we should be focused on.
But a nice byproduct, though, isn't it, that the Liberal Party, on my read of it strategically, will be a lot better off as a result of breaking this deal-making between Labor and the Greens?
I'm not sure that's right, Peter, and I think, again, the key question is, should people's votes be reflected in who is elected into the parliament or not? That's the question. And frankly, that's the substantive issue that we should be focused on. Now, as you know, under the existing system, if someone votes above the line, number one, which 97% of people do, at that point, they lose control of their preferences, and frankly, they could be going anywhere and people don't know. Now, what's going to happen under the new system is that the voter will come along and say, well, you know what? These are the 6 or 7 or 8 or however many parties I want to vote for. They will determine the manner in which their preferences are allocated. They can vote for a major party, a minor party, a medium-sized party, whoever they want, in whatever order they want. And plainly, that is a more democratic and representative system than one where, you know, a bunch of people get together and say, well, you know, I'll give you my preferences if you do this, in an opaque process that is in no way transparent to voters. It's self-evident that this system is better. And frankly, that's why in 2014, when the JSCM committee first looked at this, it was unanimously supported by all members of the committee, including the Labor members, Gary Gray and Alan Griffin. And Gary Gray indeed has spoken very eloquently in recent weeks on why this is so important. And I mean, I don't know if you saw his speech during the week, but he talked about the sanctity of the ballot box in general. And he talked about the history of even the trade union movement and the Labor Party, and how all of us should embrace the idea that people's votes should be what counts and not some backroom deal by a small number of unelected people.
Sorry. I know I heard what the Minister said on this program last week, and it just does not pass the believability test that there wasn't political self-interest as part of it. That's not
Was there political self-interest in why Labor opposed it?
Well, let's be clear. There is heaps of politics in this. There is heaps of politics in this. This is the Parliament deciding how parliamentarians are elected. You'd be a fool to think for a minute that, of course, there wasn't people looking at the political outcomes and the political consequences of this. Part of the reason that I think it's such a bad law is that it will likely result, there's no guarantees, it has the possibility and the likelihood of resulting in a more conservative Senate. I don't believe in that.
I think the important point here, Peter, is to say, well, if you oppose this Senate reform, what are you actually opposing?
Well, can I tell you the model I have?
I'll finish that.
I'll tell you what I oppose.
Let me finish. If you oppose Senate reform, what are you opposing? What you are opposing is the capacity of individual voters to personally decide how their preferences should be directed. That is entirely what you're opposing, because that is entirely what is proposed. Under the existing system, that does not happen for 97% of people. Under this system, 100% of people 100% of the time will determine how their preferences are allocated. And to oppose that, I think, particularly in an environment where your party historically had supported it, I think is extraordinary, and I think opportunistic, and I think, frankly, the scenes that we saw in the Senate, don't endear senators to the Australian people.
Hang on. There's a couple, but you covered a fair few points there. And the first bit I will concede is, yes, Gary Gray, who was our spokesperson, had a different view than the majority of the Labor Party caucus on this issue. That is a fact. Right? That is true. I'll concede that. Right? But the point of what I'm opposing is, frankly, a rort masquerading as reform. What I am opposing is a reverse engineering of a situation where the government has turned around and said, we don't like these pesky, annoying, crossbench senators, so let's engineer a model to have them removed from the process. And one of the outcomes that is likely in all of this, 1 in 4 Australians didn't vote for a major political party, and that includes the Greens and the Nats when I'm saying major political parties. And that disparate vote kind of built itself up into having some very different kind of crossbenchers elected. I believe that all being removed from the process is a bad thing. Now, the point about the crazy kind of sitting of the Senate, let's not pussyfoot around, let's get to it, right? Things got a little bit weird in the middle of the night when the Senate sat back for as many hours as it did. It got a little bit weird, but that doesn't take away from the substantive point that the Labor Party wanted to say, these are bad laws, we oppose these laws, and the sitting schedule, let's be clear, wasn't set by the opposition. The government tried to ram this through, as I call it, legislation by attrition, where they said effectively, let's just wear everyone down to the point where we will sit until it passes. We said, let's come back. Let's look at it properly.
Fine, okay. Well, let's go back to where we started. Your comments about the Greens. I remember well the interview you gave 4 years ago, and it's true, the Greens target Labor. The Greens go into Labor seats and do a lot of damage to the Labor Party. Well, you say it's time to wake up. What should Labor do?
Well, look, what I said 4 years ago, and I stand by that, and can I say, I got belted. I got belted by left-wing commentators, left-wing journalists, the left-wing kind of media for daring to say that there is a fundamental problem with the Labor-Green relationship and that it's all going to end badly. And what I said 4 years ago was it's a time for a complete reassessment of that relationship. I think that reassessment is going on right now. I think that is happening. I think when
But to Paul's point, what can you do?
Well, I think it's about having a much more aggressive aggressive stance against a lot of the issues and what they do. I mean, when you have a situation, the Greens leader was asked a question by a fashion magazine a fortnight ago, or came out a fortnight ago, where effectively was asked what's normally a pretty simple question. Would you rule out going into coalition with a Liberal Party, Liberal Conservative government? And he says, never say never. Now, there are some things when you purport to be the leader of a progressive political party you can rule out. And ruling out going into coalition with the Liberals should be part of that. Once they have crossed that threshold, once they are prepared to do that, once that is where they're going, I think it's time, and it has been time, for the Labor Party to reassess. And I think you've seen a fair bit of that going on in the past week.
But isn't it the truth that the Labor Party's too weak to reassess, that the Labor primary vote is kicking around the low 30s, maybe 35 on a good day, and that Labor, in fact, needs the Greens, despite the fact that the Greens are targeting Labor and very, very keen to steal primary votes from Labor?
What we don't need is the Greens. What we need is progressive voters. There's a difference. And I don't believe the Greens are representing progressive voters. I think when you cut deals like they've done with the government on voting reform, when you cut deals with the government like they've done on tax transparency, I think they have actually, look, if they want to behave as Liberal...
Look, they're playing the Labor Party for mugs, aren't they?
Not at all. Not at all. They are trying... No, not at all. They believe, and look, this is a decision for them, and I'm not here to defend the Greens. I'm certainly not doing that.
Well, let me jump in. I want to get your thoughts, David Coleman, on this, because it does seem like the Liberal Party have decided that the Greens aren't the sum of all evil now, with a lot of deal-making. It's almost as though the ethos of the party has changed because they've changed leaders to Senator Di Natale.
Well, Peter, what we care about is substantive reform, and if the Greens are willing to support an important reform like they were on Senate voting reform, or indeed, as Paul alluded to, on multinational tax avoidance, where the Greens had the clarity of thought to support the government's important changes there, and Labor didn't for the expedient, or they obviously thought expedient political reasons, then of course if there is a party there that is willing to support the government on sensible reform, whether it's Labor, and as you know, there are many occasions where both parties do support particular legislation.
Do you take the view, in your personal opinion, looking at the Greens, that the Liberal Party under the leadership of a Malcolm Turnbull might be capable of getting or jagging a greater share of Green preferences than might have been the case under Tony Abbott or historically?
Well, look, that's a matter for the voters. That's not a matter for me.
Yeah, but what do you think? I mean, you're in a marginal seat, so apart from anything else, put your marginal seat cap on. Is it your hope, you're on the progressive side of the Liberal Party, is it your hope that under Malcolm Turnbull's leadership, with the changes to the Senate reform process as well, that you're a better chance now of picking up more than the 10% or 15% of Green preferences that used to flow in your direction?
Well, look, my hope is that the Liberal Party vote is maximised at the next federal election, and people make their own decisions about preferences. And I mean, to ascribe a sort of one-size-fits-all mentality to voters who support the Greens or any party is wrong. And look, it's obviously up to every political party to conduct themselves as they see fit. Most of the time, or much of the time, the Greens and the coalition vehemently disagree. But there are occasions, like on Senate voting reform, where we both support structural, important reform, and that's a good thing.
We're talking to David Coleman and Senator Sam Dastyari. We need to take a quick break here on Australian Agenda. We'll be back in a moment.
If you want to know what Gonski means, for a school like mine, it means 2 extra teachers. It means 2 extra teachers that can spend one-on-one time with students, one-on-one time support, one-on-one time helping them to actually learn to read and write better. It makes a big difference.
Don't let Malcolm Turnbull stop Gonski funding. Authorised by C. Haythorpe, Australian Education Union, South Melbourne.
Life expectancy is up, but what about lifestyle expectancy? Share market falls can leave serious dents in your retirement savings, but a Challenger Guaranteed Annuity is protected from market crashes. Google Challenger Annuities.
It's a great wonder that we can connect. And yet what rotten luck you find me here in these wretched chains, this merciless hate, and all for a loaf of bread. Yet the beauty of that ocean. I have stories to share with you, my family. Come find me.
Discover your story at Ancestry.
Farmers tried many ways to combine olive oil with rich, creamy butter. until they discovered new Bertolli with butter. A delicious blend with butter and olive oil. So tasty, they fell in love with it. New Bertolli with butter. The taste of butter with the goodness of olive oil.
There's a twang, cut by a sharpness. That's what they taste like to me. Lime and black pepper potato chips from Red Rock Deli.
Welcome back. You're watching Australian Agenda. Senator Sam Dastyari, the Greens leader, suggested that they could, delay supply, or at least supply not get passed with enough time after the budget. What's your view on that?
I'd be very surprised if that happened. Look, the Labor Party has a position we've held for decades for historical reasons. We support the passing of supply. We will allow supply to pass. Look, there's obviously procedural questions about how you do these things quickly.
But you can't for the life of yourself imagine that if he put down the budget on 10 May and on 11 May tried to pass supply before calling an election that afternoon. You can't imagine
I cannot envisage a situation, if there is a clean supply bill, that Labor would not be supporting it.
Well, what about the Australian Building and Construction Commission bill? The government's made it very clear it would like this bill on a double dissolution list. Given the practical difficulties involved in this, do you think this is feasible?
No. I mean, I can't see how it is feasible. Look, the government ministers are going around and fairly openly talking about a 2nd of July double dissolution election. I've spoken to journalists like you about this, and they've said that they would like the ABCC to be part of that trigger. No one's been able to explain to me how you can possibly have a situation where in the short period of time the Senate is currently scheduled to return for, that you would be able to both have supply pass, which the Labor Party will facilitate, and we've said will facilitate, and also have the ABCC go through properly.
On that, David Coleman, what was wrong with the government? I mean, you had ample opportunities to pass the ABCC before now. I'm not talking about the stunt of it being brought on last week, but in the weeks before that, what was the government doing?
Well, it was introduced earlier this year and then was kicked off to a committee by the Senate, which had already considered the legislation previously last year. So it's the Senate itself which has sought to delay this bill.
But you could have brought it back more quickly.
Well, look, this is a very important bill and it should be supported by the Senate. And as you know, Peter, we have very high costs in the construction industry in Australia.
Yeah, but that's not the issue that I'm taking here. I'm not opposing the bill. I'm talking about, with what you're describing being so important, why didn't the government make sure they got it back in time that you couldn't get to a situation where you won't be able to have it as a trigger for a DD?
The government reintroduced this legislation many weeks ago now, and it was the Senate, not the government, that said, oh no, well, let's refer this off to a committee that's already comprehensively considered the bill in what was obviously a delaying tactic, and not, again, addressing the substantive question of the regulation of the Australian construction industry.
But just on this point, I mean, we've just heard the Senator tell us that he doesn't think it's going to be feasible at all for this bill to be a double dissolution bill. What's your view? Do you think there's a way the government can get through here and get this on a double dissolution list?
Well, look, the government has said this will be coming back at the first available opportunity in May. It is something that the Senate should pass, and the government obviously has said that it reserves all rights in relation to a double dissolution election. So the passage of the bill is a matter for the Senate. They should get on and support it. And the Prime Minister has made clear that amongst various options, a double dissolution election is one of them. But the way to resolve the ABCC issue is for the Senate to vote for it, because it's good legislation. We've got to clean up the construction industry in Australia. We want to create more construction jobs. We want more investment. And the ABCC bill is a critical part of that.
I mean, look, David's not their Senate tactician, so it's perhaps unfair to put this on him. But, the fact is, I just can't see how. I can't see the process for them doing this. Now, at this point in time, there is not the support in the Senate amongst the crossbenchers and what the crossbenchers have previously voted and what they've publicly indicated. Can that change? Of course that can change. People change their minds, people evolve. I don't think it will change. But from a simple process perspective, the government, if it intends to use this as a double dissolution trigger, needs to explain how it becomes a trigger. And so far that explanation is just not there.
We're almost out of time. Before we go, David Coleman, as Chair of the House Economics Committee, would you consider it less than ideal if the budget was dragged forward a week earlier? It'd look messy, wouldn't it?
Oh, Peter, what I'm focused on as Chair of the House Economics Committee is the substance of economic policy.
OK, well, let me quickly ask you about that. What's happened to the Federation White Paper? What's happened to the tax White Paper? Well,
the Prime Minister's obviously outlined that the budget is the key document in relation to economic policy, as it is every year. The policies obviously will be released in due course. We've already had the innovation statement, which abolished capital gains tax for investments in startups before Christmas, which is critical for the startup sector.
The innovation statement wouldn't light a fire. It was pretty thin.
Oh, no, I don't agree with that.
What about Federation?
I don't agree with that at all, Peter. I think the innovation statement was actually a very important document. The startup sector generates a disproportionate amount of jobs globally. We are not as strong as we should be in that space, and that's where we need to be growing our economy. And the innovation statement, through getting rid of capital gains tax and providing a 20% income tax relief for investments in startups, is actually going to be extremely important in generating economic growth.
Gentlemen, we're out of time. We appreciate both of you joining us in the studio. Thanks for your company.
And if I can just say, today is Persian New Year, so happy Persian New Year, Eid Mubarak.
All right, your mum will be happy. All right, Sam Destiari and David Coleman, thanks for your company.
Thank you,
Paul Kelly.